Michael, why are old organizations and their structures failing today?
Oh, wait, I'm supposed to answer that.
Yeah. Sure.
That question, or phrased a little differently, the way that I spend a lot of time wondering about it, which is why do so many well-compensated and talented people continue to deliver such mediocre results? And I think what we're finding is people spend more and more time thinking about this, particularly in a post-COVID world where we've got distributed teams, people spread all across the planet in different time zones and in different locations. How do you empower and lead those teams in a new way that works in the places where the command and control used to work and now fails us?
Well, I mean, what's wrong with command and control? What's wrong with me wanting to take a command and control position as a leader? Where I just go in and say, "Hey, this is the way we're going to do it. So get to work."
I think that the challenge of that is knowing when command and control is going to work. There are certainly situations where you need one human being making decisions and giving orders to the rest of the people because they all need to be doing the same thing at the same time. But I think in the much more modern, subtle process of decision making that the majority of knowledge workers find themselves in and the majority of leaders find themselves in, um, you can't expect one very smart, very motivated person to be able to make all the decisions and have them come out well.
So what is distributed leadership? How should we define it?
And before you answer that question, let me actually interject and introduce the show real quick. Everybody, this is a Sense and Signal podcast, and we have Michael Peachey as our guest today. Michael Peachey is a high performing and low drama user experience and product teams with focus on enterprise and consumer software organizations, from startup working to find their initial product market fit to multi-billion-dollar revenue public companies. I actually worked with Michael for a brief while at a company called Tipco, where I worked with him and a global team of on-site and remote designers that had built, starting with the first UX hire. Since then, Michael has continued to work at the intersection of product design and development and cybersecurity at Sumo Logic and Zero Wall, and remote employee collaboration at Ring Central. Michael is a frequent contributor on The Future of Work and has a keen fascination with leadership at a distance, a topic which has become even more critical in the post-COVID world with hybrid work. And I try to make that look like I wasn't reading it, but it totally looks like I just read the hell out of that. So welcome, everybody. Welcome, Michael.
Good to see you again, Jodah.
Hi, Dan. Man.
Well, Michael, getting back to distributed leadership, right? What the hell is it?
I think
and as you can tell, I'm the high drama leader, as opposed to the low drama.
Your background's in education, which is where the ideas of distributed leadership came from first. Yes. So maybe you can start answering your own question, and then we can bring that into the world of business.
Yeah. So from my perspective, distributed leadership is kind of almost like networked leadership, where authority is distributed across the organization. It's tied to expertise and people having expertise in different areas, but everybody being able to assume leadership positions at different times, depending on their expertise and their position within the organization, and that we're moving as a collective based on our mission, values, toward a common goal. And there is this idea of a collective consciousness, if you would, a shared cognitive or collective cognitive thing going on, where people are coming together as teams, sharing their knowledge and building consensus about how to make sense of the world and what's going on in order to move the organization forward. So that would be A definition ad hoc off the top of my head.
So I think what you're getting at there is the idea that many minds can be more effective than one mind, and even many average minds can be more effective than one brilliant mind when it comes to understanding a situation, finding answers, being creative, choosing a path.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think the research bears that out, that having, especially a diverse group of people with diverse worldviews and mindsets and um, areas of expertise, they can contribute more to our understanding of a situation than any one individual could, despite the fact, even if that person were incredibly intelligent and had access to chat gpt, through a neural link in their head.
I'm kind of new to this concept of distributed leadership, although the pieces are I'm intuiting them because I've been witnessing them in my world in the career. But I'm wondering, like, back to that initial question around the not about. I don't think it's an accountability question, although I think that's something to be asked. But w- where does direction? How does directionality manifest itself from a distributed decision making mechanism? Or is directionality so 1999?
So I think that, to think about my world, which is building and leading design teams. Um, and I think designers, good design teams have, maybe without using the words distributed leadership, have evolved the kinds of models that distribute some of the decision making out to the fringes of the organization, to the individuals, while retaining some of the decision making in more of a traditional command and control. So one of the examples that I'll use about command and control and where it makes sense, we talked about that earlier. Um, let's talk about the engineer, the architect of a skyscraper or a bridge. I really want that one talented person who's worked with their team to come up with the specifications for the bridge to have absolute authority over what kind of concrete should be used and how much sand is in it and how big the steel needs to be to go across the structure. That shouldn't be a distributed conversation amongst the people who are building the thing. So you want that top-down command and control. Now, how did you come up with that specification? That was probably a group of people and not just one brilliant architect. How do you build it and how do you decide which trucks come first and what goes where following the specification? That again also has to be distributed. So in design, it's not up to a distributed design team to decide what they're building. That's going to come from a product team, or it's going to come from the vision of the CEO, or it's going to come from distilled customer wisdom. But it is up to the designers to go and figure out, how is that best implemented? How are you going to measure the success? How are you going to design down that process so that you can best fulfill the requirements?
I'm going to offer another command and control situation, where a situation where command and control is useful. I think in crisis situations, you want definite leadership, who, with people in charge who know the protocols that are in place to address whatever fire, weather emergency, God forbid, shooting incident, whatever it might be. In those situations, I think you also need a command and control leadership approach. So yeah, I think it's good for us to say that command and control is not always bad, and it's all situational. In some situations, you do need that type of leadership approach. I guess it's about knowing when to be in, when should we be in a command and control approach, and when should we be in a distributed leadership approach.
Without a command and control central sort of piece, which unto itself also might be problematic. But that expertise is important in decentralized control power. That you're putting emphasis on people's knowledge and abilities to get things done, and that they know stuff. And I wonder, Dan, if the idea of having someone in a crisis scenario could still be rooted in a decentralized leadership mechanism, but that the crisis itself makes a specific expertise more relevant for decision making processes at that moment. And it becomes somehow part of the decision that everybody agrees that this is the person now to be driving this particular decision making point. But they're not necessarily, again, a leader in the classic sense, but a identified critical knowledge knower for the moment. Or is there a difference in that?
So I
Well,
wonder.
I mean, I think in crisis management, yeah, I mean, I think I can always speak to crisis management in higher education. So, like, you might have a president who's in charge of a college and they're the leader for the most part, but when that crisis occurs, they usually have to relinquish authority to the emergency response team within the city, whatever that looks like in that city's organization. Different cities, I think, probably set up their emergency responses a little bit differently depending on the resources they have. But the administration at the college knows that they step back, and then the emergency response team, and it could even, at a national level, it could be FEMA, would step in and take control of the situation because they have the expertise for how to respond. And I think people in certain types of leadership positions need to know when to step away and let those other mechanisms respond.
Mhm. And I think that what you're getting at there, again, to think about it in a business context, um, leadership is broad and it's got a lot of facets that don't always sit with the same um, identified leader that you might look at on an org chart, because there's, the job of resource allocation is different from the job of prioritization, is different from the job of deciding on a process to follow. And a classic example of leadership in a crisis situation, you think about the Apollo mission that went sideways, and a team of people at that point went into a room with a big pile of all the various things that existed up in space, and then had to figure out what was going to work and what was not going to work. So somebody, a leader, had to say, you all and not you all will be part of this process, and this is the process we're going to follow. But that leader was not responsible for the decision making. They were not responsible for the creative ideation. They were responsible for creating the environment.
That's a really good point, and that's this Apollo 13 metaphor keeps coming up in this podcast.
It
That
does.
same, I think it's popped up on 2 previous episodes, Tina Greenbaum, and I think another episode too. But it's a great example, and I like what you say about it's about creating the environment, because I think when I think about distributed leadership, I think of it as a structural thing within an organization, that the the leadership that is responsible for thinking about the structure of the organization, like the CEO and so forth, are thinking in terms of a distributed model and setting up departments and operations, and so that the organization is structured in a distributed way. Um, and that's different than that, again, that command and control traditional model from the 1950s and 20th century, where it's all coming down from on high. It's a structure that allows for emergence to happen based on where the staff and the employees are and what they can bring to the table with their diverse voices and perspectives within the organization.
Mm-hmm. So I fully agree. And to circle back onto design, often when you're trying to solve a problem and you're working on the creative ideation part of it, bringing in perspectives from non-designers can often be very helpful in unsticking a team, in finding new ways to think about things, because everybody's got a mental model based on their own experience that they apply to new situations. And the more diverse viewpoints you can bring in, the more likely you're going to cast a net that's going to catch the right answer. As a leader,
Right.
what you need to balance is, how much time do you spend casting a net
Yes.
versus how much time do you spend sifting through what you've caught and choosing likely things to pursue versus pursuing and executing on it,
Yes, yes.
because you don't have unlimited time and unlimited resources.
At this very moment for our audience, what does distributed leadership? What is it supposed to be giving us? What are the key values that it's going to be providing us? Um, and I'm assuming it's not as Dan said, and Michael, I'm assuming you kind of believe this too. Although, if not, let us know that it's not to replace the centralized leadership, but it does augment it. It's something else to also to leverage. But what value is this distributed leadership providing us? Why do we want to like go to that today?
Well, I
What's it
think
doing for us?
that any organization, whether it's a for-profit enterprise or an NGO or a family or a classroom, has got some very complex equation that they're trying to optimize, some sort of shareholder value or mission or whatever that they're working on. And they've got finite resources to get that job done. And often they're competing with other NGOs for funding or other enterprises for customers or time and attention or whatever it is they're competing for with those limited resources. So if you've got a richer toolbox for making decisions and prioritizing things, then the next organization, you're going to thrive versus your competitors versus your peers. And adding in the idea of distributed leadership, leadership at a distance, to whatever tools you've already got can only make you more competitive.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Michael said about complexity in response to this question too, because I think when I think of distributed leadership, I think of our world as being a very complex place and our organizations being very complex and really honestly too complex for one mind to grapple with. And so making sure that you have that diversity of thought and that people feel empowered to bring that to the table within the organization is really important, because that's the only way you can wrestle with complexity. And I think we might chafe or question this idea of distributed leadership because it seems to flatten out the organization. And I think, as humans, we've evolved in a way that we're used to thinking of organizations as existing within these top-down hierarchies, right? But what distributed leadership wants us to do is to flatten out the organization so that more people can be in leadership positions or step up to the plate to be in leadership positions and bring their diverse perspectives uh, to the collective consciousness of the organization to move it forward. And it sometimes, I think, could be counterintuitive to what we're used to thinking about in terms of leadership.
Agreed. Um, here's a thought though. Listening to both of you two. Um, so Michael, one of the conversations we seem to have also been having besides Apollo 13 is the note or stories. Stories are critical to leadership. That perhaps a modern leader, if we still lean on leaders in that regard, that their strengths are less about making decisions in the sense of the day to day and kind of how to do things. That they're really there to define the why we're moving forward in a particular direction, and then create the narrations by how does that resonate with you, and how does, if it does or doesn't, how does that resonate with this
Yeah,
distributed leadership?
absolutely. I mean, I think that um, as a designer, the power of a story is a key piece of the designer's portfolio. So, said the caveman sat around the campfire and came back and told a story about, I was out there, I was hunting, and I heard a rustling in the bushes, and there was a saber-toothed tiger, and I picked up this stick and I hit it on the head, and then I came back here. That's a story that helps all the other cave people think to themselves, oh, okay, next time I hear rustling in bushes, I should look for a stick in case it's a saber-toothed tiger. And it's a much more effective way to communicate that than a checklist of things or some rules to follow, because that story is visceral. Stories have got a power. The human brain is just not capable of ignoring a good story. You want to know what's
We
going to
crave
happen.
it.
And that really helps a leader in a distributed world communicate what's important. Because I can tell the stories to people and repeat those stories, and they're going to tell the stories and be much more effective at repeating a good story than they would be at repeating, a list of to-dos or the top 5 strategic imperatives of the organization, whatever else is going to be. So it ends up being a very, very powerful tool to get things done when you're not there to make sure that they're happening the way you think they ought to.
What's the favorite organizational leadership story you've heard?
The it's we're talking about this, and something that happened very early in my career post business school when I was working at American Express keeps coming to mind. So I'll tell you this story, and it's one that I've
Okay.
told at work too, because it's a story about why even the smartest person in the room can't outthink the team. So working at Amex out of business school, and we had some sort of team leader training thing come in, as they often do for recent MBA graduates, to teach you how to be better at what you're doing. And this particular one gave a scenario of, you're in a plane crash, you're in the middle of the Yukon, and these are all the things that you've got to take with you, and what are you going to do in order to survive? And everybody had to go and rank these 25 things, and I thought to myself, like, I got this. Like, I'm a big camper. Like, I ride my dirt bike. I go out into the wilderness for days by myself and cook my own. Like, I'm going to nail this. I'm going to be way better than all these other New York MBAs on this. And sure enough, me and my friend Michael both got like the highest scores out of the 20 odd people in the room in ranking these things. I was like, okay, yay, we won. And then the person leading the workshop says, okay, now we're going to break into whatever it is, 4 groups of 5 or 6 people. And you guys are all going to talk about what are the right things to do. So we go and we break into those groups, and they come back. And, as you would figure based on the topic here, each of those 4 groups outperformed even the most brilliant survivalist, me, in terms of their ability to come up with the right answer. The group mind is always going to be smarter than any one particular individual.
It makes me think on a very shallow level that carnival trick where they have like a container full of like M&Ms. There'll be like 1,000, and they ask one person, and they'll be like maybe on really close, maybe really far, but you get 100 people, and it's always like within. They take the average, and it's always within 3 of the M&M.
Mm-hmm. No, the collective wisdom of the group is always very powerful. The trade-off that you face, and we were touching on this before, how much time do you have to do these things? How much time do you have for creativity and ideation versus decision making?
Which goes back to Dan's crisis sort of comment, right?
Your crisis, right? Like your surgeon, I want him following his training and her list of like, what do I do when I'm taking out into somebody's appendix, not having a conversation with everybody in the room about
building consensus about how to do this heart operation.
Thank God that didn't happen to me.
Not sure Should I put the
guys?
stitch here?
How do you guys feel about this?
Right, exactly. What's the emotional state? I just wanted to know.
So, speaking of carnival tricks that Jodah brought up, let's talk about the occult. Have you heard of the concept of the egregore?
I'm going to go back onto my biblical training here from years and years of private school, and it's an angel of some sort, as I remember.
I think it actually comes from witchcraft or that kind of occult thing, where it is this entity that's created by a collective, like everybody within the coven or within the circle of witches or wizards or whatever it might be in this occult theory contributes to creating reality by they're mentally feeding into this almost collective consciousness.
That
And
was
so
going
I
to be my
find it
second
fast.
guess.
That would, yeah. It's an obscure concept, but it's kind of been trending lately and emerging as kind of a concept people are looking at when we think of, tribalism and um, groupthink, and things like that. And groupthink, I know, has a negative connotation, but I would even extend it to the idea of culture, because culture is constructed by a collective of people contributing to this almost invisible entity
Wait,
that kind of binds us
what's this
together.
word again? I'm sorry, Dan. What's this word that you said though? It's called a what?
Egregore.
Egregore. Isn't that also known as a corporation? I'm just kidding. So, yeah.
No, actually, it is.
Yeah.
It is. There's some writing that compares it to the idea of a corporation as well.
Manifestation of intentionality, right? Beyond
Yeah.
an
So it's
organization.
kind of interesting that this concept of this collective consciousness, or people collectively contributing to a grander entity than themselves, that's almost even invisible, right? It's kind of a bonding thing that binds us together, so we're moving in a direction together as a group, permeates even beyond this conversation of distributed leadership, which is more contemporary. It's more of a 21st century, really, framework for thinking about leadership, but that it has deep roots even as far back as the occult as well.
I think we've got the name of our next business. I'm liking the name, and I think we should add a .com to it. That's kind of where
Yeah, there we go. That
I'm just not
probably
sure
already exists.
what that
That
company is
probably
yet.
already exists. So, I mean, what are some approaches to distributed leadership, or what are some models that, especially in the tech sector, I guess, how do you approach creating distributed leadership within the tech sector?
Without alienating. Screw it. Alienate the hell out of people. I don't know. Yeah, good question.
Well, I mean, alienate or draw them into the occult.
Yeah, right.
I think I can address that again from a design perspective. When you've got a large geographically distributed team of people that need to solve problems together, you're going to break the big problems up into smaller pieces and then align distributed groups of people with different pieces. So, in the command and control way, you've got decisions that need to be made about you four over here are going to work on this, and you four over here are going to work on that. Within those pods that you create, and within those pods, you want a diversity of viewpoint and a diversity of interest. You want to empower those groups to iterate and come up with answers based on the information that they're able to go out there and get. So you're distributing the accountability, you're distributing the authority of coming up with a solution, whilst still maintaining an aggregate of prioritization so that the right things get done on the right timelines.
Okay, well, going back
One
to
of the things.
well, I'm going to have to follow up on that real quick. Going back to the alienating aspect, though, would there be a playbook or a roadmap on convincing or getting leaders to be on board with this? I'm assuming a lot of leaders have worked their butts off. Some probably have not, but I'm assuming a lot have, to get into the position that they're in. They feel rewarded for that position. And I don't mean that in any shallow way at all. I mean, based on historical approaches of what leadership is. And then you say, hey, you know what? There's this distributed leadership thing, and it's kind of perhaps taking away some of the things you thought you earned. Like, what's the roadmap to get them convinced to come on board to this? Other leaders. I mean, like you said, Michael, you're kind of a part of the groundswell sort of this process, because I think, like you mentioned, you're part of the design world historically, and that kind of is an early adopter of this. But a lot of other teams aren't, right?
So I think it's understanding what are the decisions that different people in the process get to make. So in design, we've got this idea of designers and deciders. And a healthy design team will split those two roles into different human beings, because it turns out if you let designers make decisions about whether or not their design meets the goals of the project, you get crappy design, because everybody designs for what they want. If I was in charge of the world, it would look very different than it does right now. I don't think it would be any better. It would probably be a lot worse for most people. But, it would make sense to me. At the same time, you don't want your deciders to be behaving like designers. A decider, an executive, these leaders, these old school leaders that you talk about, they may have a very good idea of, we want to sell this product to those people at this rough price point through these channels. Terrific. Now you've got your criteria. You know who you're going to be selling to, you know what the value proposition is, you know who to talk to, and try to figure out what product am I going to design for those. The executive gets to make those decisions, and nobody else gets to second guess those. I mean, maybe the other executives around them as they decide what markets they're going to go into.
Or a foolish non-executive, but yes, right, exactly.
Then it's up to the design team to take those requirements, largely without question, and go and come up with different ways of executing against those requirements, different designs that are going to work for it, and then come back and present those to the deciders to say, okay, you wanted to sell this to these people. I've got 4 different ideas of what this could be. Which of these best meets your goals? And the deciders can say this one or that one, or I don't like any of these, go back to the drawing board. But what the decider can't do is walk over to the whiteboard and start drawing what they want.
Or shouldn't.
Yeah.
Or shouldn't.
Because that's the designer's job.
Yeah.
Likewise, it's not up to the designer to say, hey, I don't think we should be making cars anymore. I really think we ought to be growing bananas. That's not in their world. So when everybody understands their role, when they understand their degrees of freedom, you've distributed the leadership. Everybody gets to be the boss of their piece and stay out of everybody else's way.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
one last thought on that. Peter Thiel wrote a book, 0 to 1. Not sure if you read it. It's actually a pretty good book. And he mentioned that one of the big killers of startups is when roles are not clearly defined. That it sucks the morale out of the space. Sorry, Dan.
Yeah, no. I'm just piggybacking on what both of you are saying. Yeah, I think the defining roles and what authority you have within your role, and understanding how the decision making process is going to work, and I is important. And I coming from a higher education perspective, I want to kind of respond to Jodah's initial question too, about why would a leader embrace a distributed approach. I'm going to get back to, it goes back to that complexity issue. Like, a lot of organizations are very complex entities. And so there's no way, if you're obsessed with having a command and control mindset within a higher education setting, you're going to fail. You're not just going to alienate everybody. You're not going to be able to do it, because there's so much. I've been in higher ed for over 20 years now, and I've in different areas. I kind of float between different kinds of departments and roles. I'm always learning how deeply complex different areas are, and humbled by what's going on behind the scenes to make the sausage, right? And I think there's also, as you go up in your leadership role too, and I think we've talked about this on some other podcasts, Jodah, you can't get into the weeds with everything. It's not your role. Your role is to have a more global, broader perspective to be able to inform decisions about whether or not we're going to grow bananas, or are we going to build a new Tesla, right? And how we are going to prioritize the budgets and human resources to get us to that end goal. But yeah, I think it's really, if you're in higher ed, you really have to embrace a distributed leadership approach. Otherwise, you won't be able to function. Um, People don't like micromanagers, right? So distributed leadership also prevents micromanaging, and people are more motivated if they have autonomy too. So if they feel like they have their own agency and they're making their own decisions within within the structures that they have been given and the authority that they've been given, that leads to more motivation and it leads to more motivation and a greater happiness within somebody's work life too.
So to double down on that, and you bring up the idea of micromanaging, and people don't like micromanaging. And one of the advantages of distributing leadership is that you give people more autonomy over how they get things done. I want to unpack that a little bit, because the opposite of micromanaging isn't macromanaging. The opposite of micromanaging is providing direction.
Yeah.
And when you research where employees struggle and the kinds of things that they complain about, setting aside sort of like organizational issues, but when they're dealing with their managers, they get complaints in two broad areas. And one is micromanaging. I know what I'm doing, and this person is just in my face all the time. They're telling me what to do and how to do it. And I would be more effective if they didn't do that. I would be more engaged. I would be more productive. The world would be a better place if I wasn't getting micromanaged. We all agree to that. The other category of complaints about leadership that employees have is, I don't get any direction. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. The priorities change all the time. I've got too many priorities. All my priorities come on and interrupt, and I can't finish anything. I'm not getting direction or leadership. So distributed leadership is not about, I'm going to sit back and just let everybody figure it out themselves. That's just abdicating the role of the leader. That's not good leadership. A leader has got to be very, very active and very engaged in providing context, in providing prioritization, helping people make decisions and know what decisions they're going to make. Because absent that, you also end up with a bunch of disengaged people. And at a distance, everybody can look busy.
Yeah, I feel like in all leadership roles, but definitely in a distributed leadership environment, the leader's role is a sense-making role and a sense-giving role, like helping people make sense of the situation that they're in, the organization that is in, their role within the organization, and what direction are we going in? And then letting them figure out, playing more of the role of the mentor and helping them figure out how they're going to do their job without policing every
Understanding where the
single step.
roadblocks are, understanding where a resource is missing, and therefore the team can execute what they're doing. Jodah may remember some of the posters and things that we had at TIBCO. One of my favorite was a quote from Saint-Exupéry, the French author. And I won't do it in French, but the English translation is roughly, if one wants to build a ship, one does not gather men and women and assign them the tasks of cutting wood and forging nails. Instead, one teaches them to long for the endless sea.
Mm.
And when you
where's
talk
that
about
desire?
Context setting, when you talk about creating that thing that gets people to move together, that's the job of the leader, to say, this is where we can be. Now, let's figure out how we're going to get there as a group.
What's that vision? What's that roadmap?
Yeah, that builds
that strategic plan.
That, like Dan said, that internal desire for that goal, and then you're activating their active senses. They're going to be fully engaged if they're aligned with the story and giving you their all, and probably adapting better than they ever would be adapting otherwise. Makes a lot of sense.
I feel like right now in the post pandemic, and I can just speak for the world I work within, I think in higher ed we've been bashing around for so long in response to world changes, around the pandemic and enrollment and all this kind of stuff, that I feel like I probably speak for a lot of people in a lot of different higher ed organizations, where they probably feel like they are unmoored and there isn't a lot of direction. Um, and so what could organizational leaders be doing to help find, grapple with the reality that we're in now, to get the ship starting to move in some more concrete directions?
So I think some organizations, when we talk about new models of leadership and how do we get people to adopt new models of leadership, um, very similar to how do you get organizations to have a sense of mission for what they're doing. I think the answer is that some will and some won't.
Yeah.
Like, luckily, none of us are immortal, which means that all of the bad habits of the current generation of leaders will eventually go away, and a new generation will rise up and replace them, like saplings replacing the trees in the forest. Now, some of the leaders may evolve and adapt, some won't. Some organizations will evolve and adapt, and some won't. And, certainly in the world of tech, you can run down a litany of organizations that were just the magnificent oak trees in the forest. I remember first moving out to the West Coast and seeing organizations that, I just like, I couldn't believe that I got to meet people who worked at digital equipment. I couldn't believe that I got to meet people who worked at Sun Microsystems or EFI, right? The people who work in those organizations all ended up someplace else, and organizations evolve and new organizations grow to take their place. And that's a good thing from a resource standpoint, because as the older organizations die off, their resources then migrate out to startups and other new organizations and take the best of what they've learned and do a little bit better and a little bit better with each generation. So how do you come up with a mission? Maybe you've got one. In which case go and try to get a bunch of people to help you go do that thing. If you don't, there's processes for sitting down and coming up with a mission and what it is that you want to accomplish. And again, some will do it well, some won't do it at all. And someone will thrive and someone won't.
And I think the important thing is making the time to do that work, and gathering the stakeholders to do that planning. Because again, it has to be a collective effort. If you want it done right, I think especially in a distributed leadership environment, you want to get input from lots of different stakeholders to make that happen. So,
and probably people like on the ground as well. I mean, you got stakeholders and people are actually performing heart surgery, and
I think that's,
you want to get the
from a distributed leadership perspective. I mean, we're talking about leaders. Anybody can be a leader, from the groundskeeper to the executive suite, right? Anybody within the organization. So you want to collect input from everybody.
So all right. So we've been speaking for 44 minutes about leadership, and one thing we haven't even brought up, which is great because it seems like it should be agnostic on one level, but it's also hyper affected, which is sort of the elephant in the room. When I'll say, let's say the imposition COVID sort of put upon us, but at the same time, it seemed like it merely kickstarted something that was going to be happening anyways, and that is physically distributed people, right? Not just distributed leadership, but we are actually physically distributed now, at least within the information world. How does that affect leadership and this notion of distributed? Does it align well with these concepts, or does it not align? Do we want to do?
I think what we're seeing is an acceleration because of the forced lockdown, this work from home experiment for a year and a half, 2 years, that a global pandemic forced on us, that changed a lot of the rules about how organizations and individuals thrive and compete. So, Dan, to your point about, everybody is the boss of themselves. Everybody is the leader of their own little world. As my 9-year-old used to say when she's 4, I'm the boss of me. And it's like, okay, you are the boss of me, but we are going to, in fact, have dinner now because that's what command and control is about.
You were giving her some direction.
Giving some direction on that. So organizations and individuals had to learn new ways to thrive and compete. So an individual as a leader of themselves had to figure out, well, what are the new rules for, how do I get recognition? How do I get the good projects? How do I build sources of information that I need in order to do my job when I'm remote on the other end of a Zoom meeting? And organizations had to learn, how do I lead at a distance? And what we saw with a lot of the research that we did at Ring Central, and for those who don't know, Ring Central markets video conferencing and telephony and messaging software that allows people in an organization to communicate with each other, whether they're in the building or remote. So COVID was an amazing experiment in terms of how people interact, how they collaborate, how they thrive. And what we saw was a changing of the rules. We saw a softer kind of leadership, the kinds of things that we're talking about with leadership at a distance, distributed leadership. The people who had those innate skills thrived, whereas people who needed that command and control, who needed to see everybody at 8:30 every morning in their conference room so they could tell them what to do each day, those people really struggled. And we saw some other really interesting things in terms of how individuals thrived because the rules changed. As we think about diversity and equity and inclusion, which are also hot topics now, a distributed environment actually levels the playing field in some really interesting ways. When everybody is the same size rectangle in a Zoom meeting, being a large white male sitting at the head of the conference room table and leaning in and monopolizing the conversation became more difficult. At the same time, people who were not used to speaking up, if they learned how to speak up in a remote environment, they developed influence that they didn't have before. The ones who didn't turn on their video and didn't talk and just kind of tried to disappear into the woodwork didn't thrive. So it was a real interesting shuffling of how people and organizations competed and thrived. And now we're seeing in this hybrid world where some people are coming back into the office, or some people are coming in some days and working from home other days, and some people are still fully remote. Their organizations and individuals are needing to work out a new set of behaviors that will allow them to thrive.
It seems to me that one of the specifics, and we can talk about anything in this space because I find this really interesting, but it seems like one of the things around this distributed workforce, it created a asynchronous pattern of engagement, or it empowered asynchronicity a little more. Of relationships, right? You didn't necessarily have, like, I've actually run meetings or tried to run meetings, but then you know what, I can't get all 7 people, so it's this asynchronous conversation. Because we're distributed, it made it easier to make that happen. But I also felt that perhaps it introduced a friction to velocity. And I'm just wondering, do we, in your experience, and did you see anything around what this distribution did to efficiencies of speed and effectiveness of the teams?
So I think that it largely depends on the organization and the task at hand. So, the example that I always use when we talk about stories, when you're thinking about work from home and the kinds of, should you allow work from home? It depends. If what you are doing is running a team of people that repair 747 jet engines, I'm going to say no. You can't work from home. You actually need to go to the airport, to the airplane, and pick up a wrench and start turning something to fix it. If your job is writing the next great American novel, I'd say by all means, go find a cabin in the woods. You don't need to be going to an office on Fifth Avenue in New York and trying to write from your cube. And everybody else is somewhere in the middle. Some people did very well in work from home. I thought it was terrific.
Oh, same here. I loved it.
I'm a little more introverted than most. It allowed me to time shift. I've got, I led a global team, so if I wasn't sleeping, I could wake up and start doing things super early in the morning with people in Ukraine, and that was great for me. I could take off for a few hours in the middle of the afternoon because everybody else was sleeping and everybody in Palo Alto was doing whatever they were doing, and I could get back online again later. So it worked out
Yeah.
terrific. Um, there are other people that I knew that as soon as it was possible to be back in person, were going into the office because they just needed that personal contact. And they had a much more difficult time. So I don't think there's a hard and fast answer. Like most interesting questions, it depends. And then the trick is understanding, well, on what.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating to see how it all settles out, because I don't think it's what's going to be the reality that we end up living in hasn't fully emerged yet. I think we're still trying to find out what the new equilibrium between remote and in person is going to be, and I'm definitely fascinated to see. I mean, I felt like I thrived, especially in my leadership role at my job. I thrived in the online environment for those 2 years. I mean, the first 6 months were very difficult. Lots of eye strain. I mean, the physical toll it took to adapt to working on Zoom for the first 6 months was difficult. And also, I feel like helping employees make that adjustment, because you had to deal with a lot of fear. You had to deal with a lot of people who were feeling very isolated, and uh, worried about, not just the pandemic, but damn, I live alone in this apartment and I can't go out and see anybody, and dealing with those emotional things. And working at a school, also dealing with students who didn't get to go to graduation or prom, and now they're in college and they've lost all these milestones, and dealing with that grief as well. There's a lot of, and then the mental health issues. I mean, I could just go on and on about all the
Mm-hmm.
different things that we had to navigate, especially during that first year. But once we got, I think maybe by January 2021, at least for me, I felt like I had fully adapted, and I saw other people fully adapted to being online. And now we're going into this shift where we're coming back to campus, or at least a lot of people are. And, I still miss being able to be at home 5 days a week. I'm on campus a couple, 4 days a week, because I manage a lot of in-person facing offerings or departments. So I feel obligated to be there to support the team, but I also see how it can impact productivity too. Like, there is an aspect of working from home where you don't have as many distractions, but at the same time, being in person allows you to have those interpersonal connections that are maybe a little bit deeper than you can have in an online environment. So it's a lot of really rich, interesting questions around where we're headed, and what that means for when thinking about distributed leadership as well. That was more of a monologue than a question.
Oh, lots of questions in there.
And I think it comes down to leading with intention, leading with intentionality, doing things on purpose. So, you're talking about a lot of the facets of this very difficult, complex equation of socialization and tribal knowledge transfer and efficiency and not having to commute and social isolation and distractions in the work environment versus distractions in the home environment. And it's all very complex. I think the answer for the leader, or somebody who's listening to this podcast that is in a leadership position, formally or informally, because they're using influence to get things done, is to be intentional and think about, who am I interacting with and what do they need from me in this interaction?
Yeah.
Is there somebody on my team who is feeling socially isolated? How do I bring that person in and nurture their need for social and emotional connection? Because if you do, as a leader, and you get that person engaged, you've now got a more powerful and productive team than the next person in your organization. Your team is going to be more successful. than the next person in the organization. Your team is going to get the next big project. You're going to thrive as a leader, and the people around you are going to thrive because you're doing that job that a leader needs to do, which is to get people engaged, to get people focused and motivated. So the answer is going to be different for everybody on every team. There's no checklist. If I could write a checklist, I'd do it. I'd publish it. I'd charge everybody $1 and I'd be rich. But the one thing that I can say is be intentional. Do things on purpose.
Let me
Yeah.
add one check to that checklist that we're not going to build. What about this notion? So as Dan was mentioning, and you're kind of alluding to, um, there is the intentional engagements, that intrapersonal relationship that occurs going to the office. I even think about Tipco. I mean, it was a large company, but we had good connections with people. I still have friendships from there. I mean, being the age I am, it's where I make my friends. Really, is at
Mm-hmm.
work. Call that sad. I don't go to the bars or the clubs and dance anymore to make new connections. Right, that stopped
Mm-hmm.
3 months ago. Right, so
You
it's
just got married.
just recently I got married, so can't do that anymore. But um, should we ask our organizations to try to recreate that through cloud-based communication mechanisms? Is it behooving upon them to fix that problem
I
digitally?
think that it's the organization's job, it's the leader's job, and it's the individual employee's job. I don't think anybody can sit back and say this is somebody else's problem to solve. So I've got a 22-year-old daughter, recently graduated from Cal Poly, got a good job, working from home. She is not getting that mentoring that a new employee
Right.
would in an organization. To your point, Joda, about socialization and making friends at work, she's not meeting her work friends and going out to happy hours and going running in the park with them and things like that. She does not have those things handed to her the way that maybe one of the three of us would when we got out of school and got our first jobs and our first internships. Um, she has to take responsibility, and I'm talking to you, Lauren, for recreating the things that she needs in order to thrive. Because she can't expect her boss to know those things. She can't expect the organization she's working for to know those things. It would be great if they do, but they don't. So she's
Yeah.
got to take that accountability for herself to make sure that she gets nurtured in that holistic way. Um,
It's
somebody who's a
interesting you bring
leader.
this up, Michael, because one of our previous a couple of episodes ago we had Hassan Sorrells on, who's a leadership coach out of Texas, and he said a very similar thing as you're talking about, in terms of that it's not just the leader's responsibility for creating the organizational story or addressing things, but it's also the followers too, like that it's everybody within that relationship that is has a responsibility for addressing the needs of the
Yeah.
organization. And I guess to your point, yeah, if people who are not in a necessarily a leadership position, maybe they're again in an informal one where they have influence, whatever type of role they have, they need to make their voice heard or figure out ways to build that community if they feel like they need it.
I'll
So
agree
yeah,
with
I think
what
that's
you
a really good
said,
point.
but I'm going to challenge the idea of leader and follower in that sense. An
Yeah.
organization, and I'll talk about my daughter Lauren again, she has a boss. She has somebody whose job it is to assign her tasks, to evaluate her work, to make sure that she's got the resources she needs to be successful. But Lauren is still the boss of herself. She is the leader
Yes.
of Lauren Incorporated. And it's incumbent upon her as a leader to make sure that she's got the resources and that she knows the context and things like that. It's incumbent on her organization to nurture good managers, and it's incumbent upon those managers to develop themselves so they can develop their teams. And when managers, and when individuals, if they can do those three things, if all three of them can grow and adapt, that organization, that manager, that individual are going to thrive versus their peers, versus their competitors. So everybody's got accountability.
Yeah, I think you bring up a theme I did want to touch on as part of this conversation, which is training for leaders. And so what do you think, what kind of leadership training do you think people need to receive to thrive in a distributed environment?
Actually, not just leadership. What kind of training do people need to live in that kind of environment?
I think that, as we were talking about before with the research that we're doing at Ring Central through the COVID environment, and what we saw, the people who thrived were the ones who had what would generally have been considered the softer skills, the kinds of courses that your HR department wanted you to take on, you know, teamwork and leadership under adversity and embracing inclusion and the rest of that kind of softer stuff that flew in the face of the traditional command and control. I would say to a manager out there that's working in an organization that's got a training program, go take those classes. If for no other reason than you're going to be around a group of people and you might not be so socially isolated, but go out there and learn
Yeah.
those soft skills, because that, in this world of distributed leadership, is where your competitive edge is going to come from. Can you engage your team? Can you get 85% out of everybody instead of 85% out of some people and 60% out of some? Because if you can, your team is going to be more powerful and more effective. And you as a leader are going to be more powerful and more effective. And your organization is going to be more powerful and effective, which means it'll get more customers. So it'll get more money that they can hire more people for your team, and you'll continue to grow.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the community building aspect of training, because one of the hats I took on during the pandemic in my role at the college I work at is really learning and development, and managing a lot of that at the college. And one of the things I saw immediately was the opportunity to build community during the pandemic when everyone was working remotely, and really trying to be intentional about designing learning experiences that would build that community and help strengthen those organizational ties and cultural sharing and stuff like that. And recently I've realized that a lot of the people who really attended a lot of those trainings during the pandemic were actually very new hires, people who probably were seeking out a way to connect with the organization because they didn't have the context of the physical in-person culture. So they were looking to connect with us in some other
They
way.
were
And,
hungry
and
for
the
that. They
training
were
opportunities
thirsty
became a
for
way
that
to
kind
do
of
that.
connection. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that going back to that idea of intentional leadership, providing those opportunities for your team to nurture that aspect of who they are, of their whole self. At Zero Wall, the last organization that I worked for, we were fully distributed. We did not have an office. We had a PO box. We would get together, those of us who are here in the Bay Area, once a month or so, um, not for a brainstorming or a joint application development session, but just to socialize. This is
Yeah.
post COVID. We could all go and meet in person. We'd go down to Half Moon Bay and sit out there on the deck, 8, 10, however many people were going.
Oh.
And those lunches would last 4 or 5 hours
Yes.
because people wanted that social connection. And there was some work chit chat that was going on,
Of
but it
course.
was mostly that need to be around the people that you worked with and collaborated with and cared about in your work environment. And I think that one of the things that came out of this COVID pandemic that was surprising to me, and Jodah, Dan, I'd be curious about your thoughts on this. I think a lot of people did not understand the importance of their work friends. People would talk
Yeah.
about like, well, they're just my work friends. And when I leave that organization, I'm not going to talk to those people again. I might keep one of them or two of them, maybe, that I'm going to see once a year. And then I'm going to think about once a year and then I'll forget about. And therefore, my work friends are not valuable to me. And I think what people learned is, oh my goodness, like I need those work friends.
Yeah.
I need that human and emotional and social connection to the people I work with. And maybe they won't be my friends for my whole life, but right now, oh, I'm missing them.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Actually, two things I agree with. One is you're not going to bend my arm to meet up in Half Moon Bay for any reason. That's going to
Yeah,
be an easy
I think
sell.
we've been there together, right, Jonah? Yeah.
Probably a couple dates. I don't remember, but it was, yes, definitely. Um, but I'm particularly a social person, and I think from my perspective, I get collective sort of alignment when I'm around people. There's just a
Hmm.
maybe it's the pheromones, maybe it's something else. I don't know. But when I'm actually in the physical space of them, I build better empathy. I build better sympathy. I just build, and that could be an age thing, right? Maybe if I was 23, I don't need that. Maybe online's
No,
good
you were
enough.
like that when you were 23.
I
I
was like that when I
remember.
was 23 too. That's true, But so I totally. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, my friends. I mean, Jay Cromwell was at my wedding,
Hmm.
So I mean, yes, I pick these people up, and for me, each job I have is an adventure to find new friends. It's maybe I think when I die, I'm going to look back on my jobs and realize all I was trying to do was collect friends. That's all I was trying
There you
to do.
go.
Huh?
Yeah. So yes, I agree. Hey guys, so we are beyond the hour, and that's not necessarily we have to stop necessarily talking, but I'd like to just say we're getting close to wrapping up. Are there any final thoughts for that you'd like to express?
Well,
Any
I
call
have I
outs?
have one last question I'd like to ask Michael. What's the future? What do we've had this whole conversation about distributed leadership and especially in the context of leadership and then in the context of tech and um, remote operations. I guess that's the phrase I'm looking for. How do you see all of that balancing out in the next 5 years between remote work and in person? What's your prediction?
That's a fantastic question, and I've got two answers to it, depending on how optimistic I'm feeling about the future. Um, in the best of all possible worlds, the acceleration of people thinking about remote work, work from anywhere, hybrid workforce, some people in the office, some people from home, is fantastic because you've now created an opportunity that for people that would have been disenfranchised in the old way of doing things to be able to contribute and thrive. So the new mother doesn't have to choose between her career and taking care of the child. If you can,
Right.
and Jody, you talked about time shifting before, the asynchronous work. If you can work from home, and if you can't make a meeting, you can watch a recording of the meeting because you were out taking care of a child or an older parent or a spouse with a medical issue or whatever it is. Like, wow, that person can now contribute and not get left behind. And that team, that leader, has now got an employee that can contribute and help the team and help the organization thrive. So that's just terrific. It opens up all kinds of opportunities for people who are remote. So you don't have to live within commute distance of a city center where all the jobs are and where all the houses are expensive and all the condos are small. You can go live someplace where your kids have got a bigger yard, or you can go do the kinds of things that you want to do because you can telecommute into work. You can work at a distance.
Right.
So it's just fantastic in that sense. Um, when I'm in my more dystopian moods, I worry a lot about the future of work because, again, thinking about the hybrid environment where some people are in the office and some people aren't. And Dan, going back to some of your comments about access to information and mentorship and being able to build relationships, the people who are in the office are going to be the ones that are around the leaders and around the mentors. And when it's time to
Right.
hand out the great new Jones project to somebody, it's human nature to kind of work line of sight, and it's human nature to prefer the people that you're more comfortable with, who are the ones that are around you. So you start to create an environment in this scenario of haves and have-nots, where
Yeah.
people who are in the office have got access to things that people who are remote don't. And the people who are remote start to get more piecework and less strategic kinds of things to do. because those are the easiest things to go do at a distance if you're not a particularly thoughtful leader. Like, okay, you three are going to help me think about the future of the company, and you three over there are going to file the TPS reports in triplicate. And you
Yeah.
start to get a gig economy that's going to skew, as these things often do, on very traditional lines of gender and race and economics. So coming back to distributed leadership, I want to call on anybody who's listening to this to be intentional and think about, how do you not create the dystopian future? How do you create the future that we want?
I was just going to
Great
say,
answer.
so that means people who live in San Francisco, Palo Alto, Daly City, for those who are not, who are Bay centric, those will be the people in the power center. Those who are in Manteca or Livermore, they will likely be kind of off. They'll be in a different side, and then you can basically have a class system by those who can get in, and because they couldn't afford to live in San Francisco, right? But the power centers would be able to afford to live in San
So
Francisco.
that's the dystopian future. The other
Right.
future, which I think is just as likely and within our grasp, is that I don't have to live in Palo Alto. I can move to the outskirts of Philadelphia and still keep my tech job and be able to take care of my aging father,
Right.
because I don't have to go into the office.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be awesome for me and for him? So we have this control.
Yeah, and I think there probably are ways that you could set up mechanisms for people in leadership positions to be cognizant of that. It's really a mindset, right? And are you checking yourself? Are you putting checks and balances in place to make sure that doesn't happen? I'm going to think about our hiring process at the college I work at right now, where it's kind of a fascinating thing where the hiring process has been redesigned so the hiring manager cannot be on the initial search committee for a new hire. They can't share it. So they don't see the three finalists for a new position until after they've gone through the first committee, right? And that, I think, is designed to prevent bias or
Mhm.
the program manager from having too much sway in who gets hired, right? They get the three finalists, and
Well,
that's who they got to select from. So I think
like
you can
any good
think about
story,
processes like that to help prevent that dystopia you're talking about.
like any good story, we circle back to where we started, and we were talking about designers and deciders before, and what you're describing is exactly that process. Let the team go and source candidates that meet the requirements without the bias of the hiring manager winnowing that field in a suboptimal way. Let the hiring
Right.
manager still make the decision from the candidates that have been presented. And, how does this happen? I think that Jodah, you and Dan are exactly how this happened. By creating a forum to be able to talk about these ideas, to be able to put these ideas into people's heads through the work that you do. That's how we, as knowledge workers, that's how we as influencers evolve and enhance the world that we're working in. So you guys are doing good work.
Thanks, man.
Well, thank you, Michael.
Appreciate
It's
that.
been a pleasure having you
Been a
on this
pleasure.
podcast. This has been
One last, so before we go, and I think we're well past time. Any final thoughts other than thank you again for that? Any final thoughts on what we've discussed that you want to leave for your daughter or for the world or for Dan? Dan needs some advice too.
I definitely love final thoughts.
So any final thoughts or not?
I'm just going to double down on the idea of acting with intention. Think about
Yeah.
what it is that you want to accomplish with your time as a leader, whether you're the leader of yourself, whether you're the leader of a team, whether you're the leader of an entire organization. Be intentional and do things on purpose, and you will thrive.
Cool. Well, thank you
Well, thank you,
very much.
Michael.
Yeah.
And if people want to get in contact with you, I think you have a blog and things like that, or do you have a blog or a place where people can read your thoughts or?
Well, probably the easiest way to find peachey.com, Peachey, will give you something to click on that will eventually make noise in my world, and I'll know you tried to get in touch with me.
And I'm assuming, you are on
Oh,
LinkedIn
okay.
as well. So
Correct.
in
Yep.
LinkedIn, so that's
Yeah.
established.
So we'll make sure to post links to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes and your website.
Awesome.
Thanks, man. All right.
Hey, thanks for hanging out with me. This was awesome.
Cool. Appreciate it.
Yeah, this was a super fascinating conversation. So thank you.
Yep. All right, everybody. Bye. Later.
Take care.